Welcome to the Bourbon Obsessed Bourbon News podcast for Friday, December 13th. Yes, it's a Friday the 13th, and I think that sends some shivers down all of our spines, but hopefully things will turn out for the best. I am Ed from BourbonObsessed.com, also known on Instagram as Bourbon_Obsessed. This is the podcast version of my bi-weekly Bourbon News newsletter. The print version can be found on BourbonObsessed.com. Before we dive into all of the news, and there's quite a bit of it this week, I just wanted to share with you what's new on the website. We've got a bunch of new reviews, and you can read the full versions on my website, but here's a little capsule of them now. I've reviewed Sagamore Spirit Double Oak Rye. It's a rye that starts with Sagamore's 4 to 5 year old high and low rye whiskeys. They are then blended and finished in toasted wave-stave barrels for an additional 18 months. This is one of my favorite Sagamore Spirit ryes. It's a great rye for anyone who enjoys rich barrel flavors and isn't afraid of a nice amount of dry oak and tannins. Next, I tried World Whiskey Society's Wyatt Earp Hazmat 13-year whiskey. It comes in at a whopping 164.67 proof. Yes, you heard that right. Very high. It's a 13-year American whiskey crafted from a mash bill of 73% malted barley, 14.9% malted rye, and 12.1% malted wheat. It's one of the most unique whiskeys I've tried. I like my samples so much, in fact, that I ordered a bottle as soon as they became available on the website. Next up was Old Elk Straight Rye Whiskey. I have reviewed a whole bunch of Old Elk whiskeys, but I realized that I had never reviewed the rye, which is part of their core lineup, so I needed to do that. It's distilled at MGP, now Ross & Squibb, with a mash bill of 95% rye and 5% malted barley. It's aged for 5 years and then proofed down using Old Elk's slow cut proofing process. It has classic but very well balanced rye flavors and is a pleasant mix of citrus, spice, caramel, and sweetness too. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to sit down with master distiller Owen Martin and a small group of media people to taste through some of Angel's Envy's cask strength bourbons, including the latest one. This year's release is unique since it uses bourbon finished in both Angel's Envy's usual ruby port barrels as well as tawny port barrels, which is different for them. Something else special for this year is that this year's release contains about 70% of Angel's Envy's own distillate. Last year's release contained about 50%, but prior years were all sourced. That's because Angel's Envy really hasn't been distilling for all that long, and the cask strength release uses older aged whiskeys, therefore they would have to be sourced. But now as Angel's Envy's whiskey's getting older, they're able to use more and more of it. Overall, it's a very full-flavored whiskey with noticeable port wine notes, but it's very well balanced and has a nice amount of hot cinnamon spice as well, particularly in the finish. Finally, I tried 10-Day Bourbon Surgeon's Cut. If you are not familiar with the brand, it was started by 3 doctors, and the name 10-Day Bourbon is an homage to the frequency of which prescriptions for medicinal whiskey could be written for a person during Prohibition. That was 1 pint every 10 days. Later on, that was reduced to a half pint every 10 days, but it's unclear how effectively that was actually enforced. Surgeon's Cut is aged for 10 years and bottled at barrel strength, which in this case is 110 proof. It starts out fairly sweet with dark cherries, caramel, light honey, and rye spices, and becomes drier and spicier in the finish. It's an enjoyable pour with an interesting progression of flavors. The full reviews of all of these whiskeys are available on BourbonObsessed.com. Maybe someday there will be podcast versions of my reviews as well, but at this point, there just aren't enough hours in the day. Alrighty, let's move on to the news. I would have thought that it'd be a pretty slow news time this time of year with the holidays and all, but actually, there's quite a bit going on. Balanced Distilling in Smiths Grove, Kentucky, is the newest member of the Kentucky Distillers Association. Balance is a veteran-owned and operated distillery founded by Luke Jean in 2020. They began production in 2022. They started with batches of rum, gin, moonshine, and whiskey, but they're now resurrecting the historic Mammoth Cave bourbon brand that dates back to the 1860s. For those who aren't familiar with Mammoth Cave, it's a national park in western Kentucky and is home to the world's longest-known cave system. It's actually a really cool place to visit if you haven't been there. The Beam Private Barrel Club is a new program from James B. Beam Distilling, allowing individuals or groups to select their own barrel of Beam whiskey. The initial offerings will be Knob Creek Bourbon and Rye. Pricing will vary depending on bottle yield, as each barrel price will be determined on a per-bottle basis. The cost per bottle starts at $59.99, and typically the barrels will yield 100 to 175 bottles. That's actually a pretty large range. The experience can be booked on the Beam website and includes a behind-the-scenes tour as well as lunch at the kitchen table, the on-premise restaurant. This next story has been a big topic of discussion in the bourbon community the last couple of weeks. Kentucky Owl and Stoli USA filed for bankruptcy. A variety of factors reportedly have contributed to the bankruptcy filing, including damages from a cyber attack earlier this year, causing many of their business activities to have to be performed manually since. That apparently caused some problems with the filing of their paperwork and tracking their payments to their lenders. They've also had issues with the Russian government. There's the pullback in the spirits industry, especially for higher-priced whiskeys, and they've had some disputes with their lenders. If you're not familiar with Kentucky Owl, it was started by Dixon Dedman and the Carters a number of years ago. They were focusing on small batch, higher aged, and high-quality bourbons. They were soon bought out by Stoli, and then there were plans for building a large facility in Bardstown, including pyramids and a train. That's yet to materialize. And also, since that time, the brand has changed its appearance somewhat. It released the lower-priced Wise Men line and a bunch of other miscellaneous releases, some of which are quite expensive. I was a big fan of the brand back in the day and really do love their ryes. However, I haven't bought them much lately due to the high prices. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the brand as they emerge from bankruptcy. Buffalo Trace Distillery is celebrating the holidays with a variety of experiences. They have a complimentary drive-through light show where you can see the decorations at the distillery. They have a walk-through experience called Spirited Nights, which is ticketed, and there's also some food and beverage options available when you do that, and Toast of the Trace, which is a premium tasting and shopping experience. The press release for this has come out after the Spirited Nights and Toast of the Trace were already sold out. However, they say that more tickets are going to be added for Spirited Nights. You can find out more information on their website. I don't usually talk all that much about cocktails, but the name of this one made me want to include it. Elijah Craig is putting an elevated twist on a beloved holiday tradition with the launch of Craignog, a new limited edition luxury eggnog cocktail designed for its award-winning Elijah Craig small batch bourbon. It's available online nationally as a cocktail kit for $79.99, and with that, you get a 375 milliliter bottle of bourbon as well as all of the ingredients for the eggnog except the egg yolks, and it also comes with a nice etched Elijah Craig pitcher. In Chicago and New York City, they're also offering the Craignog in ready-to-drink cans. There are some interesting financing opportunities rolling around for non-distilling brands. Bardstown Bourbon Company and Brendiamo will launch an exclusive barrel leasing program. According to the companies, roughly one-third of the cost of a new fill barrel is tied up in the wood used to make the barrel. This program allows brands to simplify this significant upfront expense into manageable monthly payments, offering customers the flexibility to plan for tomorrow while maintaining the cash flow to support their needs today. Whiskey House of Kentucky has also partnered with Whiskey Capital to provide its clients with barrel financing options. Our last news item is that the Van Winkle collection for 2024 was just officially unveiled. I know it's been around in some areas for a few weeks already, but the press release just came out. In fact, in our area, our local Kroger had their annual Pappy Lottery the day after Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, I didn't get a bottle. Anyway, this year's lineup includes all the old favorites, including the Old Rip Van Winkle 10-year, the Old Rip Van Winkle Special Reserve Bourbon 12-year-old, also known as Lot B, the old Rip Van Winkle Family Reserve 13-year-old rye, and the 3 Pappy Van Winkle bourbons, the 15-year-old, the 20-year-old, and the 23-year-old. They say this year that there are more bottles of the 20 and 23-year-old than in years past, although I don't expect to find them on the shelf anytime soon. But hopefully some of you will get lucky finding them. So that's a little more news than I expected this week. And now we'll move on to the new whiskey releases, which again, there are quite a few of. Heaven Hill announced the Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond Fall 2024 release. I think we were all wondering where this was since it's already mid-December and we hadn't heard anything about it. It is an 11-year-old bourbon. It was produced in the fall of 2013 and bottled in the fall of 2024. Since it is bottled in bond, it's bottled at 100 proof, and the suggested retail price is $154.99. Wheelhorse Whiskey is releasing their oldest bourbon to date. The Wheelhorse Double Oak 5-year bourbon is distilled at Green River Distilling Co. in Owensboro, Kentucky, and then aged more than 4 years, and then transferred to new charred oak barrels for final aging. It's bottled at 101 proof, and the suggested price is $34.99. Penelope Bourbon has a new release, and it's sort of following in the footsteps of their very popular Rio, in that it uses 2 different finishing barrels. Penelope Havana is the latest release in Penelope Bourbon's Cooper series. It's made from a mash bill of 74% corn, 7% rye, 16% wheat, and 3% malted barley. It's initially aged for 4 years. It's then finished for 12 months in Caribbean rum casks, and then for 1 more month in a unique former maple syrup barrel. Those barrels at one point had aged Penelope's bourbon, then were used for barrel-aged maple syrup, and then came back to be used for the finishing barrel for this bourbon. It's bottled at 93 proof, and suggested price is $79.99. If you're a fan of Woodford's batch-proof bourbon, the 2024 expression was just announced. It's blended from more than 100 barrels from different dates of production and matured in various warehouses and on different floors within those warehouses. So quite a mix of bourbons to create the flavor profile they were going for. It's available nationwide at retailers as well as online in certain states and in limited quantities at the distillery. This year's release is bottled at 119.5 proof, and the suggested retail price is $149.99. How do you feel about the batch proof? For me, I found some to be really good, but others to be not quite as impressive. But I am interested in trying this batch. Beam has announced the release of the 4th and final 2024 Booker's Bourbon. Booker's Jimmy batch, with number 2024-4, is pretty cool since it's named after the master distiller for another distillery. It's named after Jimmy Russell, who we all know as a bourbon icon and longtime master distiller at Wild Turkey. But it shows the camaraderie of the bourbon industry, and Jimmy was said to be one of Booker No's dearest peers, competitors, and most importantly, friends. Like all Booker's batches, they are quite transparent about what's in the bottle. 12% came from the 5th floor of 7-story warehouse Z, 20% came from the 5th floor of 7-story warehouse 1, 46% came from the 3rd floor of 7-story warehouse 3, and 22% came from the 4th floor of 7-story warehouse Q. The batch is made from 3 different production dates, stored in those 4 different warehouses. It's bottled at 125.8 proof, and like all Booker's bourbons, Jimmy's batch is uncut and unfiltered. The age given is 7 years, 9 months, and 19 days, but presumably that is the age of the youngest bourbon in the bottle, as we know that multiple production dates were used. I always enjoy Booker's, and I'm looking forward to trying this one as well. This next one is an interesting release from Still Austin in Austin, Texas. I actually just picked up a bottle of this the other day, and I'm looking forward to trying it. I was actually surprised to find it in Kentucky, but glad I did. Anyway, Still Austin Tanager Cigar Blend Whiskey uses the old world, and I'm going to mess this up, Petit O. Small waters blending technique. The base bourbon was crafted from a combination of red, white, and blue corn bourbon, along with select rye and malted barley, and aged a minimum of 5 years. It was then blended with Still Austin's finest 6-year-old high rye bourbon, which was combined with pure Texas water, allowing it to age at 50 proof for at least a year. This is the small waters or petite O part of it. And then that was added to the base whiskey for final proofing. It's bottled at 106 proof, and the suggested price is $149. And of course, Nancy Fraley, who works with Still Austin, was involved with this batch, and I expect it to be really good. I'm excited to try it. Next up is the latest in Old Forester's 117 series. This one is called Warehouse I, and it was announced and released on Repeal Day, which was December 5th. It's an 11-year-old bourbon, and it was aged in, not unsurprisingly, Warehouse I, and selected from the hottest floors. It's sold out online and at the distillery on Repeal Day, but I suspect it will be available intermittently at the distillery and with certain visitor experiences, as that's what's happened in the past. It will also be available in select Kentucky retailers. It's bottled at 95 proof, and it's priced at $64.99 for a 375 milliliter bottle. Our last release this week is Hidden Barn Slow Fade Bourbon. It's the 10th and latest release in Hidden Barn's Series 1 line. It's a blend of 5 to 6 year old barrels, distilled at Neely Family Distillery, and blended by Jackie Zykan. It's named for its sweet, slow fade on the finish. It's bottled at 106.5 proof, and suggested price is $79.99. So there are quite a few new bourbons to try. Some we can probably get a hold of. Some of them might be a bit more difficult. I still have my fingers crossed for the Pappies, just like everyone else, but don't have high hopes, so it's always a pleasant surprise if we wind up with one. Well, that about does it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of the Bourbon Obsessed Bourbon News Podcast. Since my next edition won't be for a couple of weeks, I hope you all have a fantastic holiday season. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, or happy whatever you may be celebrating. Be sure to like and follow us at your preferred podcast provider so that you don't miss an episode. You can also head over to bourbonobsessed.com to read the print version of my newsletter and sign up to have it delivered directly to your inbox. While you're on my website, you can also read some of our over 300 bourbon reviews and over 50 distillery write-ups. You can also find me on Instagram at bourbon_obsessed and on Facebook at Bourbon Obsessed. Have a great weekend and holiday season. I hope you get to enjoy some fantastic whiskeys. Cheers!